I found the bank statements in a shipping box, of all places, 3 weeks after my grandmother's funeral, because my cousin Naomi had asked me to help sort her closets before the estate sale. And somewhere between a box of winter coats and a box of old photographs was a manila envelope stuffed with 6 months of statements from an account I didn't know existed. I almost didn't open it. I was tired, and grief makes you want to move fast through tasks like this. Get them done, get out of the house that still smelled like her. But something about the envelope being hidden inside a box of coats, instead of filed with everything else, made me pull the papers out anyway. The account was in my grandmother's name, with Naomi listed as power of attorney, which made sense since Naomi lived 20 minutes away and had handled Grandma's care for the 2 years I was working overseas. What didn't make sense were the withdrawals. Large ones, monthly, going out to a payee I didn't recognize, right alongside smaller ones for things that looked plausible: the pharmacy, the grocery store, the home health aide. I sat down on the closet floor with the statements spread out around me and started doing the math without meaning to, the way I do math automatically when numbers don't add up. And by the third page, I had a running total that made my hands go still. Over 6 months, nearly $40,000 had left that account in transfers to an entity called Sunridge Consulting LLC, a name that meant absolutely nothing to me, attached to a business I had never once heard my grandmother or Naomi mention in 2 years of phone calls and video chats, where I asked every single time how things were going and was told every single time that everything was fine. I sat there on that closet floor a long while after the math stopped changing, listening to the estate sale team moving furniture in another room, muffled voices discussing prices for things that had once just been my grandmother's ordinary life. And I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that whatever this turned out to be, I was going to need to understand every piece of it before I let anyone else know I'd found it. My name is Priya. I'm 35. I spent the 2 years before my grandmother's death working as a structural engineer on a bridge project in Southeast Asia, a job I took partly for the experience and partly because I trusted completely that my family had things handled at home. Naomi is my cousin, 3 years older, the daughter of my mother's sister. And growing up, we were closer than most sisters I knew, closer than my actual sister, if I'm honest. We shared a room every summer at Grandma's lake house. We went to the same college 2 years apart. She was the one who taught me to drive on the back roads near her parents' place because my own parents were too anxious to do it themselves. When Grandma's memory started slipping 4 years ago, it was Naomi who stepped up without being asked, who moved the visits from weekly to daily, who set up the home health aide and researched the memory care specialists, and called me every few weeks with updates so calm and thorough, I never once felt the need to double-check anything. I was grateful for that in a way I don't think I can fully explain to someone who hasn't lived far from an aging parent or grandparent. The specific relief of trusting that someone competent and loving has it handled while you're a 12-hour flight away, unable to do anything yourself even if you wanted to. I sent money when Naomi asked for it, for things like a stair lift or an upgraded aide schedule, and I never once asked for receipts because asking felt like an insult to a woman who had rearranged her entire life to take care of a person we both loved. I believed without question for 2 full years that Naomi's version of events was the whole truth. I had no reason, not one, to think otherwise. I told people at work when they asked how I managed a demanding overseas job while my grandmother's health declined that I was lucky, genuinely lucky, to have a cousin like Naomi holding things together. And I meant it every time I said it, without a flicker of doubt behind the words. I even wrote it in a card once on Naomi's birthday, thanking her plainly for being the reason I could sleep at night knowing our grandmother was cared for. And I remember her thanking me back, warmly, in a way that gave nothing away at all. I need you to understand Naomi as I actually understood her. Because for 30 years, she was never anything close to a villain in my life. Naomi has always been the responsible one, the one relatives call first in a crisis, the one who shows up at 2 a.m. without complaint and organizes everyone else's chaos into something manageable. She has a way of making people feel steadied just by being in the room, a competence that reads as safety, and I leaned on that safety completely for years without ever once questioning what it cost her to maintain it. Underneath that competence, though, was something I only understood clearly in hindsight. Naomi had spent most of her adult life financially behind where she felt she should be, watching her own parents struggle after a business failure, watching me build a stable, well-paid career abroad, while she stayed local, took on the caregiving, and quietly resented, I think, that responsibility and reward in our family never seemed to land on the same person. I don't think Naomi set out at the start to steal from our grandmother. I think what happened is smaller and sadder than that. I think somewhere in year 1 of managing grandma's care, exhausted and underpaid for the actual labor of it, she started paying herself informally for tasks nobody else was doing, telling herself it was fair, telling herself I would understand if she ever had to explain it, telling herself grandma would have wanted her taken care of too. And then, I think, once that first informal payment didn't trigger any consequence, the amounts grew, and the justification grew with them, until an actual business entity existed specifically to make the withdrawals look legitimate to anyone who might eventually check. I don't think she is a monster. I think she is a woman who let an old, real unfairness curdle slowly into something she stopped being able to name honestly, even to herself. I've tried, since, to hold both truths about her at once, without letting either one cancel the other out. That she genuinely loved our grandmother, and that loving her did not stop Naomi from deciding, quietly, that she was also entitled to take. Both things sat inside her at once, I think, the same way grief and betrayal sat inside me at once, months later, in a kitchen that used to feel like the safest room I knew. Looking back, I can trace the first shift to around 18 months ago, when Naomi mentioned on one of our calls that she'd started handling Grandma's bills more directly since the paperwork had gotten confusing for everyone else to track. And I said that made sense, since she was the one there and I was thousands of miles away, with a 6-hour time difference making anything more collaborative genuinely difficult. A few months after that, she stopped forwarding me copies of the monthly budget spreadsheet she used to send without me asking, and when I noticed months later and mentioned it, she said she'd switched systems and would send an updated version, which she never quite did, and I let it go because chasing a spreadsheet felt petty against the real, exhausting work she was doing every day that I wasn't there for. Then my mother mentioned in passing that Naomi had bought a new car, a nicer one than I'd have expected given what I knew about her salary, and I thought briefly that it was probably financed and didn't think about it again. Then Grandma, in one of our last real conversations before her memory declined further, said something about the consulting people coming by to help with paperwork. And I asked Naomi about it afterward, and she said Grandma sometimes confused the home health agency's back office team with something more formal, that dementia does that, blurs categories. And I accepted the explanation completely because it was plausible, because dementia genuinely does that. Then about 8 months ago, I asked whether we should think about consolidating Grandma's accounts to make things simpler, and Naomi changed the subject twice before circling back with a vague answer about how her financial advisor said it was better to keep things as they were. And I let that go too, telling myself I didn't understand the details well enough to push. Every one of these moments, alone, sounded completely reasonable. It's only now, lined up together, that I can see the shape they were quietly forming the whole time. Each individual explanation had just enough plausibility to survive on its own, which I think is exactly why the whole pattern took 2 full years to surface. No single moment was ever damning enough by itself to justify the discomfort of pushing harder against someone I loved and trusted completely. Around the 6-month mark, after that consolidation conversation, I stopped being able to file these things away as isolated and reasonable, not because I made a conscious choice to stop, but because there were simply too many of them piling up in the same direction. I started keeping a private list on my phone, not an accusation, just a record. Dates and details noted the way you'd log symptoms before a doctor's appointment, so you don't lose the thread later. The stopped spreadsheet, my mother's comment about the car, Grandma's mention of the consulting people, the dodged consolidation question. I didn't act on any of it yet, and I think, honestly, I was afraid of what acting on it would mean, because Naomi wasn't just a cousin on paper. She was the person who'd taught me to parallel park, who'd sat with me through my parents' divorce when I was 14, who I would have said, without hesitation, right up until the shipping box, understood our family better than anyone else alive. Questioning any of this felt like risking a relationship I genuinely did not want to lose. And for months, I chose the version of events that kept that relationship intact over the version my own quiet list was building toward. But once you've truly seen a pattern's shape, you can't unsee it. Every new detail after that stopped landing as its own confusing event and started snapping directly into place. 2 months before Grandma died, a family friend mentioned that Naomi had been talking about finally being able to breathe financially now that things with Grandma's care were sorted properly. And something about the specific phrase, sorted properly, sat wrong with me in a way I couldn't fully articulate at the time. I didn't say anything to the friend. I just felt something settle low and cold in my stomach, the particular, unmistakable feeling of understanding arriving a beat before the actual proof does. And some part of me, even then, started quietly bracing for whatever was coming. I didn't have a name for what I was bracing for yet, only a low, steady hum of dread that followed me through the last weeks of my grandmother's life, sitting beside her hospital bed while trying, and mostly failing, to keep my attention fully on her instead of on the growing unease I couldn't yet justify to anyone, including myself. Sitting on that closet floor with the statement spread around me is the moment this stopped being a vague unease and became a fact I had to physically absorb. And I want to describe honestly what that felt like, because it wasn't loud. It was almost entirely silent. I remember the specific cold that moved through my hands first, the kind that has nothing to do with the temperature of a room, spreading slowly up my arms while I kept doing the math over and over, as if a different total might appear if I recalculated it enough times. I thought about every phone call over those 2 years where I'd asked how things were going and been told everything was fine, every single time, in a tone so steady I never once thought to press further. I thought about the money I'd sent cheerfully without asking for receipts because asking had felt like an insult to a woman doing the hardest, least visible work in our family. I thought about my grandmother in the last year of her life, confused and frightened by her own mind, unable to track her own finances even if she'd wanted to, entirely dependent on the one person she trusted most to protect what little she had left. I sat there for what must have been 30 minutes, not moving, not crying yet, just letting the fact settle into my body the way you let cold water settle around you instead of flinching against it. Eventually, I put the statements back into the envelope carefully in the same order I'd found them and slid the envelope back into the box of coats exactly where it had been. because some instinct in me already understood I needed time before Naomi knew I'd seen anything. I drove home that night with the radio off in complete silence, and somewhere on that drive, without fully deciding to, I made the decision that would shape everything after it. I was not going to confront her yet. Not until I understood the full scope of what had actually happened, and not until I had enough proof that her explanations, whatever they turned out to be, wouldn't be able to move me. I sat in my parked car outside my own house for a long time after that drive, engine off, hands still on the wheel, feeling the specific, unfamiliar sensation of grieving two losses at once: my grandmother and the version of Naomi I'd carried in my head for 30 years. Both gone in the space of a single closet floor. I want to be honest about what it cost me to choose patience over the immediate confrontation every part of me wanted, because that instinct was real and it was strong. There's a version of that night where I call Naomi from my car in the driveway of the storage unit and demand an explanation right then. And some part of me genuinely wanted that release, wanted to hear her voice catch, wanted the relief of saying the true thing out loud instead of carrying it silently for even one more day. I didn't do that, and I made myself not do that because I understood exactly how it would go if I did. Naomi is composed under pressure in a way few people I know are, and a confrontation built only on my raw suspicion and grief would hand her every advantage. Time to construct an explanation, the emotional high ground of being accused right after losing her grandmother too, the ability to make my urgency look like an overreaction rather than a legitimate response to real numbers. I had watched Naomi steady entire rooms of panicking relatives during medical emergencies with nothing but calm, controlled language. I was not going to hand her a chance to do the same thing to me. So instead, for the following several weeks, I stayed close and steady on the surface. I called her about estate sale logistics. I asked about her own 2 kids, her job, how she was holding up. I let her tell me, at one point, that dealing with Grandma's finances after the fact was such a headache. And I said that sounded exhausting and meant absolutely none of the sympathy in my voice, only the shape of the words themselves. That performance cost me something I hadn't expected. There were nights I hung up the phone and sat in my car in my own driveway for 10, 15 minutes, unable to go inside yet because holding 2 entirely opposite realities in my chest takes a toll grief alone doesn't prepare you for. But I needed her to keep believing she was safe, because a person who believes she is safe keeps behaving the same way, keeps leaving the same doors unlocked. And I intended to look through every one of them before I said a single word about what I had found. I started with the bank itself, requesting, as a co-executor of the estate now that Grandma had passed, a full transaction history on the account going back to when Naomi's power of attorney had first been established. That request alone surfaced 18 months of transfers to Sunridge Consulting LLC, far more than the 6 months I'd found in the closet, totaling just under $90,000. I brought everything to our family's estate attorney, a precise, unflappable woman named Miss Cower, who pulled the state business registry and found that Sunridge Consulting LLC had been registered 14 months earlier, with Naomi listed as the sole member at a registered address that turned out to be Naomi's own home. There was no actual consulting service being provided to anyone. The LLC existed for exactly one purpose, as far as either of us could determine: to receive transfers from my grandmother's account and make them look to any casual observer like legitimate business expenses, rather than personal withdrawals. Miss Cower helped me request copies of the original power of attorney documents, and we confirmed the authority Naomi had been granted was specifically limited to managing care-related expenses, with an explicit clause requiring consultation with other named family members, myself included, for any expenditure above a modest threshold. A clause that every single Sunridge transfer had quietly violated. I pulled our old text and email threads, screenshotting the handling bills more directly message, the dodged spreadsheet follow-up, the vague financial advisor deflection, building a simple, dated timeline the way I'd build any engineering report. Factual, sourced, no interpretation the documents themselves didn't already support. Miss Cower confirmed that what I had, cumulatively, was no longer a family disagreement about caregiving compensation. It was a documented pattern of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult with a paper trail thorough enough to act on with real legal weight behind it. Miss Cower told me near the end of that meeting that cases this cleanly documented rarely came across her desk. And I remember feeling almost nothing at the observation, just a flat, practical relief that the numbers themselves finally would be allowed to speak louder than anyone's version of events, including my own grief-clouded first instincts. She also warned me, gently, that pursuing this fully would likely fracture the family for good, and asked whether I wanted to proceed anyway, and I remember answering without hesitation that a family built on not noticing this wasn't one worth protecting in its current shape. Nobody tells you the hardest part of building a case against someone you love isn't the building itself, it's continuing to function normally on top of it while you do. During those weeks, I still went to work, still reviewed structural load calculations with total focus because the job doesn't pause for what's happening in the rest of your life, and I still helped coordinate Grandma's memorial service with Naomi, sitting beside her at a florist shop picking out arrangements while carrying, silently, the knowledge of exactly what she'd done. I lost sleep in a specific, textured way, not spiraling exactly, but waking at 3 or 4 in the morning with transfer dates already assembling themselves in my mind before I was fully conscious, my body treating the entire situation like an ongoing threat that required constant, low-grade monitoring even in sleep. I grieved something during those weeks I hadn't expected to grieve on top of losing my grandmother, which was the specific, easy trust Naomi and I used to have, the version of our relationship where I never had to calculate what I said to her before I said it. Sitting beside her at that florist shop, both of us crying at the exact same arrangement of white lilies for entirely different, overlapping reasons, I felt something like whiplash, real grief and real betrayal occupying the exact same moment, neither one canceling the other out. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found during that stretch. Not my mother, not my sister, not even my husband beyond the barest outline, because I wasn't ready yet for anyone else's reaction to shape mine before I'd fully sat with it myself. I've thought about that choice often since, and the honest answer is that I needed to carry it alone for a while, needed to know exactly who I was going to become on the other side of it before I let anyone else's grief or anger get tangled up with my own. There's a particular loneliness to that kind of secret keeping that I don't think I fully understood until I was living inside it, smiling at a funeral reception, accepting condolences, all while carrying a second, entirely separate grief that nobody in that room yet knew existed. I remember catching my own reflection in a hallway mirror at one point that day and not fully recognizing the calm on my own face, wondering distantly when exactly I'd learned to hold something like this so completely still. There was one conversation I kept avoiding, and it wasn't with Naomi. It was with the home health aide, a warm, careful woman named Delphine, who had worked with Grandma for the final year and a half of her life, and who I trusted instinctively, in the way you trust someone who was kind to a person you loved when that person couldn't fully advocate for herself anymore. I put off calling her for almost 2 weeks, mostly because I wasn't sure what I was even hoping to learn. But when I finally did, what she told me reframed everything I thought I already understood. Delphine said that roughly a year earlier, Naomi had asked her quietly to start billing certain visits under a different company name, explaining it as a tax simplification Grandma's accountant had recommended. And Delphine, trusting the family member managing the finances, had simply complied. invoicing Sunridge Consulting for hours she was in fact genuinely working. That meant Naomi hadn't only siphoned funds through invented invoices, she had also redirected some portion of Delphine's actual honest labor through the same shell entity, blending real expenses with fabricated ones so thoroughly that even a careful audit would struggle, at a glance, to separate the legitimate work from what wasn't legitimate at all. This wasn't a woman who'd made one desperate decision under financial strain and let it snowball unexamined. This was a system, built deliberately over more than a year, layered specifically to survive scrutiny, if anyone ever came looking. Sitting in my kitchen after that call, I understood the scope of what I was dealing with had changed again, become larger and more calculated than even the numbers alone had suggested. And I felt something in me finally settle into complete, unhesitating clarity about what came next. Delphine, for her part, was mortified when she understood what her honest invoices had actually been used to disguise, and she offered, unprompted, to put everything she remembered in writing, which told me something important about the difference between the people who'd been used in this and the person who had done the using. I thanked her, sincerely, for her honesty, and told her plainly that none of what came next was going to involve holding her responsible for work she had genuinely, faithfully done. She thanked me for that quietly, and I could hear in her voice a version of the same relief I imagine I would have felt if our positions had somehow been reversed. Once I had everything laid out, the 18 months of transfers, the Shell LLC registered to Naomi's own address, the violated power of attorney clause, Delphine's account of the billing redirection, I finally let myself ask the question I'd been circling since that closet floor. Why? Not the mechanics, which by then I understood completely, but the actual human why. The reason a woman does this to the grandmother who helped raise her through her own parents' hardest years. When I sat with everything I actually knew about Naomi, the business failure that shaped her childhood, the years of watching cousins build stable lives elsewhere while she stayed and did the unglamorous, unpaid labor of care, the answer that assembled itself wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't really about greed in the way I'd first assumed. I think Naomi needed, somewhere in that first exhausting year of caregiving, some proof that her sacrifice was being seen and compensated by someone. And when that proof didn't come from the rest of us in any form she found sufficient, she started manufacturing it herself, quietly, one small justified transfer at a time, until the justification became a system too elaborate to walk back from without admitting exactly what it had become. That understanding didn't make what she did acceptable. It didn't undo $90,000 taken from a woman who could no longer track her own accounts. And it didn't undo the real risk Naomi's actions had exposed our grandmother to in her most vulnerable final years. But it did shift the story out of the shape where Naomi was simply a predator and our grandmother was simply an easy target, into a sadder, truer shape where an old, unaddressed unfairness in our family had been left to fester until one person decided, quietly and then systematically, to correct it herself, without ever asking anyone whether that correction was fair. The damage was enormous and entirely real. The reason underneath it was smaller and more human than I wanted it to be. And understanding that Naomi's why never once made me reconsider whether to pursue what had actually been taken.
I asked Naomi to meet me at Grandma's kitchen table, the same one we'd sat at as kids doing homework while Grandma cooked, telling her I wanted to go over some final estate details before the sale closed, which was true only in the narrowest technical sense. I brought a folder, plain and unremarkable, because I wanted its weight in my hands to speak before I did. I laid everything out in order. The full transaction history beside the power of attorney's explicit spending limits, then Sunridge registration documents, then Miss Kaur's written summary, then a printed note of what Delphine had told me, dated and initialed. I did not raise my voice once. I did not ask her to explain herself because I already knew with complete certainty what shape that explanation would try to take, and I hadn't come there for it. I told her, quietly, that I wasn't asking her to admit to anything out loud because the documents didn't need her word, only her eyes moving across them. I watched her go very still while she read, watched the exact choreography I'd braced myself for begin to form, her careful reframing starting behind her eyes before she'd even reached the second page, her hands flat on the table like she was steadying herself against something physical. I let the silence hold, though silence has never come naturally to me, though my instinct in every relationship I've ever had has been to fill space, smooth it, make things easier for the other person immediately. I made myself sit inside it anyway because I finally understood the silence itself was doing more work in that kitchen than anything I could have said aloud. Before I stood up, I told her one thing only, that Miss Core had already begun the formal process to recover the funds through the estate, that this was no longer a conversation between just the two of us, that it now had its own legal momentum entirely separate from whatever she might say next. I closed the folder, stood, and laughed before she spoke, because whatever came first would be reflex, not truth. Walking to my car afterward, I felt none of the satisfaction I'd half expected after weeks of imagining that exact conversation, only a clean, quiet exhaustion, the particular tiredness that comes from finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying alone, in silence, for far longer than anyone should have to.
She called me 7 times over the next 3 days, and I let every one of them go to voicemail. The text that came instead told me plainly what kind of response I was actually going to get. There was no, "You're right, I'm so sorry, I don't know how it got this far." There was, "I think you're misunderstanding the full picture of what I was doing for her, and I gave up 2 years of my life for this family and nobody else showed up." And on the last text, "Please don't let a lawyer destroy this family over something you don't fully understand," which wasn't an apology. It was a warning, dressed carefully in grievance, and I recognized the dressing instantly because I'd watched Naomi use grievance, skillfully, to steady other people's panic my entire life, just never aimed quite like this at me. She showed up at my house 5 days later, and I let her in, not because I doubted anything I'd found, but because I was finished performing anything for her, and wanted to see, plainly, what remained once the performance stopped on both sides at once. She cried, and I believe some part of that grief was genuine, some real mourning for what this meant for us, even while another part of her, underneath it, was still visibly calculating how much of the fallout she might still be able to manage. She said, "I did everything for her and nobody else showed up," more than once. And each time I thought about the 18 months of transfers, the shell company registered to her own home, the redirected billing, and understood that I did everything for her and I quietly built a system to take from her without telling anyone, could both be true in her mind simultaneously, without her ever fully looking at the seam between them. She never used the word steal. She used words like compensation and what I was owed. Something in that room still shifted permanently, though. Not her confessing, but me, watching her reach for the old, familiar reframe and feeling, completely, that it no longer moved me at all. She left my house that evening without either of us saying anything close to goodbye, and I stood in my doorway afterward for a moment, watching her taillights disappear down the street, feeling the strange, hollow quiet of a decision that had already, somewhere back on that closet floor, been fully made. The recovery process through the estate took nearly 9 months, and it cost more than I want to say out loud, even now, not just in legal fees, but in the specific exhaustion of fighting for money that should never have needed fighting for in the first place. Most of the funds were eventually recovered, though not all of it, since some had already been spent in ways that were harder to trace and reverse. Naomi is no longer speaking to most of the family, having decided, it seems, that the version of events where she was wronged is easier to live inside than the version the documents actually support. Here's what the win actually cost me, underneath the recovered money and the legal fees. I lost the specific, easy trust I used to extend by default to the people I loved most. The trust that let me send money without asking questions, believe a calm voice on the phone without wondering what it might be covering. I don't know if I'll fully get that ease back, and some days I'm not sure I even want it back, because it made me easy to reassure for far longer than it should have. I lost the version of my childhood I used to carry around as simple and whole, the summers at the lake house, the driving lessons on the back roads, all of it now shadowed by a version of Naomi I didn't know existed inside the one I loved. I had to rebuild how I trust people, entirely, from a harder, more careful place. One that asks for receipts now, on principle, even from family. And I'm not going to pretend that version of me is worse, but she is colder. And there are days I genuinely miss the ease I used to move through my closest relationships with before I understood exactly what that ease could cost the people who couldn't fully protect themselves anymore. I still send money to family members who need it, because I refuse to let one betrayal turn me into someone who withholds generosity out of fear. But I ask questions now, plainly and without apology, and I no longer mistake discomfort at asking for a reason not to. My mother says I've changed since all of this, and she isn't wrong, though I don't think she means it as a criticism. I think she's noticed, the way I have, that a softer version of me simply couldn't have carried this the way it needed to be carried. I still have the lake house now, inherited jointly with my sister, and I go there most summers, standing sometimes in the kitchen where Naomi and I once did homework side by side while our grandmother cooked, thinking about the closet floor, the statements spread out around me, the 30 minutes I sat there before I could move again. I want to tell you honestly what I was actually deciding in those 30 minutes, because I don't think I explained it fully enough at the start. I wasn't only grieving, not by the end of it. I was deciding, quietly, without any drama to it at all, that I was now the only person responsible for protecting what was left of my grandmother's legacy, and that I was in fact entirely capable of doing exactly that. Even from thousands of miles away, even years too late to have prevented what had already happened. I think about that decision often, not because of Naomi specifically, but because of what it taught me about myself at 35, a woman who had always assumed her precision belonged only to bridges and load calculations, discovering it could hold up just as steadily against something this personal, this painful. I don't know if Naomi and I will ever speak again in any real way, and I've made a slow, uneven peace with not knowing that yet. What I do know, the only thing I can offer you at the end of this, is that the people capable of the coldest betrayals are rarely strangers circling from outside a family. They're the ones already trusted with the keys, the ones we hand the keys to willingly, because loving someone has always meant, to people like me, believing them without needing proof. I don't regret trusting Naomi. I only regret how long it took me to notice the trust had already been spent. Some evenings, standing at that lake house window with the water going gold at dusk, I think my grandmother would understand exactly why I did what I did, quietly, methodically, without asking anyone's permission, in the same family she spent her whole life trying, imperfectly, to hold together. I don't know exactly what she'd say to Naomi if she could, but I know what she'd say to me because she said some version of it to me many times while she was alive, that noticing is its own kind of love, and looking away, however gently intended, never once was.